good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Arctic is fast becoming the next geopolitical flashpoint. This is because recently US President Donald Trump has renewed his threats to annex Greenland, which is currently a territory of its NATO ally Denmark. Now, Trump insists the US will act over Greenland, quote, whether they like it or not, end quote. And is this about US's national security, or is it a redefinition of how power is being exercised in a rules-based world? So joining me on the show is Dr Chong Ja Ian from the Department of Political Science at National University of Singapore. Ian, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. So how do we make sense of what Donald Trump is saying? I mean, how should we understand Trump's statements about doing something in Greenland, regardless of Greenlandic or Danish consent?
So certainly, I mean, it sounds very much like a threat. It sounds very much like President Trump saying that he wants to do whatever it is that he can get away with. Whether that is a sort of bargaining ploy, remember, President Trump is all about deals. He's all about, hard bargaining. So it could be him trying to strike a hard bargain. It could be him meaning it. The issue with dealing with the current Trump administration is that it's really hard to discern whether it's a bargaining position or whether it's something that Trump really won't want to do. So that uncertainty, of course, I suppose, is designed to add pressure on the Greenlandic and Danish governments.
Okay, so Trump has cited risks of Russia, risks of China, quote unquote, taking over Greenland. I'm just wondering how credible those security concerns are. What's your take?
All right. So it's unclear from President Trump's statements what exactly he means. Now, there have been discussions before about PRC firms buying into the Greenland mining industry. So apart from fish, their big other industry is mining. They have various kinds of ores, including rare earth metals. And so that's something that, of course, the US is keeping an eye on and would probably like to keep the PRC and Russia off of those resources. That having been said, the US does have a strong relationship, defense relation, and security relationship with Denmark. In Greenland, it's actually had a long-standing military presence since the Cold War, and that's not going away. The cooperation between Denmark and the US, including in Greenland, that didn't seem to be under serious question before. So it's not clear whether, if there's some sort of military takeover, whether that's the point. Then there's the issue of the Northwest Passage with the unfortunate reality of global warming. We're seeing that the Arctic waters are melting, and that opens up the greater possibility for some of the months of the year, if not the whole year, for shipping to go through. Now, that would make the Arctic a much more important sea route than it currently is. And there is the possibility that, President Trump and the US would like to be able to have access and to have some degree of control over those sea lanes. But that's something they can already do with their military presence in Greenland. So basically, I have to apologize. I can't really give you anything more than...
Right. The President Trump has been quite explicit in his desire to acquire Greenland. Has Beijing been as explicit? What do we know about what China's stance is in terms of Greenland and the Arctic?
So historically, the PRC had been interested in Greenland for those ores that I talked about, and economically it would make sense for them. And as many of your audience would know, the PRC has been going around the world trying to buy up rare earths and other minerals that it needs. So historically, that's how it viewed Greenland. Now, with the melting of the Arctic ice, as I had mentioned, the PRC is also trying to position itself as what it calls a near Arctic nation in order to use those types of shipping lanes. So those are the interests that Beijing has. It's been very quiet right now, probably because it, for one, doesn't want to unnecessarily inflame ties with the U.S. Very brittle, the very brittle stability that they have. For another, the PRC is looking at a visit by Donald Trump in the spring and a return visit by General Secretary Xi Jinping to the US after that. And insofar as they hope those visits happen and there's some stabilization of the US PRC relationship, they probably don't want to make moves that would unsettle those kinds of possibilities at this point.
Okay, I'm just wondering whether Greenland is should we consider Greenland a flashpoint in the US-China geopolitical tensions, the power competition that we've been seeing for the past year or so? What do you think, Ian?
So, I mean, Greenland definitely has points of contention to do with its minerals, but whether the PRC is in a position to really do anything is a different story altogether. It's very far away. It doesn't have any strategic assets nearby. I mean, do bear in mind the recent raid on Venezuela. That was a state where the PRC did provide military assistance, but again, it was very far away. There was very little that the PRC could do. They had a envoy visit just before the raid and essentially the kidnapping happened, and there was nothing they could do. So similarly, they could do deals with Denmark and Greenland, but to physically protect those assets that they managed to acquire, that's a different magnitude of difficulty for the PRC at this point.
Right. How do we make sense of the fact that Greenland is under Danish rule? So is it unusual for a sitting US president to, I guess, publicly threaten action against a territory of a NATO ally? Is there concern about the impact that this may have in the relationship?
So definitely it is I think, shock to NATO members. But do bear in mind that in the national security strategy document that the US had put across, late last year, they did say NATO is important, but they, certainly are de-emphasizing it in terms of their own national security. So in that respect, I suppose under this Trump administration, as opposed to his previous term as president, there is a fraying of the NATO relationship. Whether that is a sort of permanent trajectory or not, we don't really know yet. But certainly there's pressure on that relationship, and as to U.S. presidents wanting to seize and take territory and so on and so forth. I mean, look, I guess over the past few decades, perhaps since after the Second World War, we've been used to a U.S. that has been relatively, not absolutely, but relatively restrained, right? It did have many military ventures that, were very devastating. Some of them sort of very ill-advised. But that having been said, it's been relatively restrained. This sort of seizing of territory harks back to a U.S. that, of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? Where, major powers went around and seized what they wanted. And for much of the time, much of modern history, that was the case.
Then how does that impact the rules-based order? All the recent happenings, so the Venezuelan president's abduction, the threats to Cuba now to make a deal, and now the threats to take over or to take Greenland. How do we frame all of this in the context of this being a test of international norms and law?
So certainly that is a test of the current rules-based order that emphasizes a certain degree of legality, a certain degree of institutional restraint on major powers, but that has been eroding for a long time under the US, but also the PRC and also Russia. So we may be getting back to a period where there is a lot more sort of open, sharp elbow sort of seizure of territory by major powers. That rules-based stuff, we talk a lot about that in Southeast Asia because most of us are small and medium-sized states, and it helps us out, right? It makes us at least legally equal, even though we don't have that same capability. It allows us to have a seat at the table. It allows us to amplify our voices. For major powers, they don't need that. Historically, they've never needed that. So that sort of post-Second World period, post-Cold War period is a bit of an exception. So we talk a lot about the rules-based order, whether major powers see that in the same way, or even if they use that language, whether they mean the same thing. Look, every major power thinks that they are the most benign, most helpful, most virtuous political actor around. We've seen that from the age of colonialism till today. But they act how they will.
So based on what you've seen so far, what you're seeing, what do you think will happen? Do you think Donald Trump will buy, will take, or will share Greenland? And what will you be watching out for next to confirm what you suspect?
That's a really great question. I think I don't really know what he will do, but that's not the point. I think the bigger point is what sort of accommodation will come about, because that will be an indication of where the Trump administration might be headed. So if you see accommodation by the European side and the Trump administration just doesn't care, that would suggest that the current sitting president is uninterested in a lot of these rules and existing alliances. So frameworks, agreements that various countries have set up with the US might be more in jeopardy of change. That applies to almost anybody. The other is, if there's some sort of accommodation that comes about, it suggests that the Trump administration may have very, very broad demands at the outset, but there can be some sort of mutual accommodation. So that's also interesting to watch. So I mean, I can't predict what will happen, but I do think it is an important indication of where the Trump administration is going.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing some of your analysis with us. I appreciate your time. Dr Chong Ja Ian from National University of Singapore there. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our conversation about US President Donald Trump's renewed threats towards Greenland, insisting that the US will act regardless of Greenlandic or Danish consent. Can a superpower simply do what it wants? Joining me on the show to discuss this further is Dr Prashanth Parameswaran, who is a fellow at the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security, which is based in Washington, D.C. He's also the founder of the ASEAN Wonk Newsletter. Prashanth, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. So Donald Trump has talked a lot about wanting Greenland. He's talked about it since even his first presidency in, I think 2019 it was when he brought it up. So what do you think he, and if I may use his words, wants it so badly? Why does he want it so badly?
So I think if you talk to defense planners, Melissa, they would argue that actually there's really no need for the United States to fully acquire Greenland by force or purchase it entirely to realize U.S. strategic objectives. The U.S. already has a military treaty through Denmark, which has been going on for a long time. And actually, Denmark has privately and publicly also mentioned that they're open to actually furthering and expanding relationships with the United States. But I think President Trump is not really using the logic of military strategy as he often does. He's using the logic of real estate, right? So when he was asked last week, for example, when he brought in energy executives to the White House, and he was asked explicitly, I mean, why are you so hell-bent on actually acquiring Greenland as territory? He simply said, it's very different when you purchase something. You have a lot more worth and feeling towards it rather than when you actually lease it or rent it. So if you use the logic of real estate, that's actually very different from the logic of military strategy or traditional foreign policy. And I would argue this is actually pretty unprecedented in US foreign policy. We've had the United States pursue a lot of territories, right? I mean, acquiring Alaska from Russia, the Louisiana Purchase from France, even the Philippines for a while being colonized after the Spanish-American War. But we've never really had an American president who has pursued expansionist objectives from the perspective of real estate rather than from the perspective of foreign policy or military strategy. So I think if you don't understand that logic, a lot of President Trump's actions look kind of out of step. But if you kind of get where he's coming from, which is, we have decades of experience from his writings and what he's kind of talked about, and he's very consistent on this, that even when he wrote The Art of the Deal, right, the sort of idea of leverage and pursuing negotiations and kind of threatening the most extreme scenario, even if you're not actually going to do it. So I think a lot of these tendencies are at play with respect to this approach towards Greenland.
Okay, so when you say he could be threatening the most extreme measures, and his words of using, taking, if it's not able to make a deal using the easy way, he might have to do it the hard way. Let's assume the easy way is taking the real estate approach, acquiring Greenland. But what if he has to do it the hard way? How real is the risk of military escalation here?
And I think this is the biggest concern or worry that we are seeing, right? Because I think if you envision the most extreme scenario, which is an actual US military intervention to acquire Greenland that goes against what Denmark is saying, technically that would trigger a sort of NATO coming to the defense of Denmark, because Denmark is a member of NATO. And actually, the only time which Article 5 of NATO has been triggered has actually been in the defense of the United States after the September 11 attacks. So we would have a very odd scenario where the last time Article 5 was triggered, NATO was coming to the defense of the United States. And this time, if Article 5 were triggered, NATO would actually be confronting a threat from the United States. And so I think that scenario is not very likely at this time. But I would also say that there's been a lot of things that have been going on, behind the scenes. Some of it has surfaced in public conversations. For example, we've seen a lot of scrutiny with respect to Denmark releasing information about covert operations that the United States is already conducting in Greenland. We've seen actually public statements by the United States saying that, well, why are we just having conversations with Denmark? We have Greenlanders and their own objectives, and they're actually a self-governing entity. So maybe we should have conversations with them relative to Denmark. And so I think the sort of point of military intervention is an interesting thing to think about, but I would spend a lot more time thinking about what might happen below the sort of threshold of military intervention or war. And I think there's already a lot of things that are happening in this. I mean, similar to the conversations we've been having with respect to the gray zone, a hybrid war, and some of these situations. I suspect that Denmark and NATO and some of the European countries are already talking about contingencies about, how to react and respond to these U.S. actions.
Could you flesh that out first? Just expand a little bit. What are the possible scenarios that could be at play here?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're talking about a scenario with respect to what President Trump has signaled, which is he actually wants, he's explicitly said this, I don't want to take military intervention. What I want to do is essentially exert leverage and US pressure to make sure that the United States is able to get more of an interest in Greenland to avoid what he argues is Russian and Chinese encroachments with respect to Greenland. And then secondly, territorial expansion with respect to the United States. And so you can do that through military intervention, but I suspect what's already happening is President Trump and the administration at large is already arguing, why is this only a two-way conversation between the United States and Denmark? We should bring the Greenlanders into the conversation, and we should kind of expand that conversation. And when that gets very murky, because Denmark's relationship with Greenland is also quite complex. So you're already seeing actually Greenlanders and politicians in Greenland sort of say, why is this a negotiation between the United States and Denmark and NATO? We deserve a seat at the table, and you should be talking to us as well. So I would say that's one thing to watch. The second thing that I would watch is also how the United States actually exerts leverage and influence that it already has in Greenland, right? Because let's not forget, the United States already has a presence in Greenland. And if you talk to defense planners, they'll say that, the United States, with its military presence already in Greenland, let alone what the US military could bring to bear, it already has tremendous latitude in how it could operate and think about contingencies. So that's, I think, another thing to watch. Now, we've already seen some things publicized that the Trump administration has done. For example, President Trump has appointed a special envoy to Greenland, right? And we've already seen some of these kind of diplomatic talks and negotiations that are going on. But I would say also watch the information space and how the United States could try to figure out some of the contingencies in that domain. I think a lot of times there's a focus on the military aspect of statecraft, but not necessarily some of the diplomatic, the informational, and the economic needs, right? And of course, the big point that you brought up as well in the earlier part of the conversation is NATO. We're already seeing the Europeans actually come up with public statements saying that they need to support a fellow NATO member. This would be a huge violation of the rules-based order. But let's not forget that the Trump administration is also trying to pressure NATO into doing more. So what are you doing to resist influence from China? What are you doing to resist influence from Russia? And NATO has come up with a bunch of statements, and European countries have talked about this publicly, about maybe we should actually be doing more military operations and exercises with respect to potential contingencies. So I think with respect to ongoing negotiations and talks, I would expect the Trump administration to be very clear and direct to NATO to sort of say, okay, well, you're talking about this with respect to Denmark and you want to make this a NATO issue. But if we've got China and Russia thinking about their interests in Greenland, what does that mean for the United States, and how are you going to help us? And I think that's another part of the conversation that I think is pretty uncertain, because we're all familiar with what J.D. Vance sort of said during one of his early trips to Europe about the Trump administration's perspective on Europe. And President Trump actually shares those perspectives entirely, and he's recalled those remarks consistently as well.
Right. Well, so this is what you're saying is very much broadly in line with what we saw the Trump administration put out in its national security strategy last year as well, when dealing with NATO or its future with NATO. I'm curious to know how this is all playing out in the US. Prashanth, are you, from a domestic US perspective, are there political calculations that might be at play here for President Trump? Does US public opinion play any role in maybe shaping possible outcomes here?
Well, it's a great question, Melissa, because I think if you look at the example of the US intervention in Venezuela, which it's been very interesting to see the global reactions, including in Southeast Asia, where you've had a bunch of ministerial statements, but actually Prime Minister Anwar, I think, stands as probably the only leader in Southeast Asia so far who has weighed in heavily on, criticizing the United States for intervention in Venezuela. And I think a lot of countries are very carefully thinking, how do they calibrate their approach with respect to the Trump administration? But I think the other part of this agenda is the fact that US domestic politics remains pretty uncertain. And a lot of Southeast Asian countries, if you talk to officials, working with the United States and, with respect to Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on and so forth, everybody knows that there's the midterm elections coming up. And everybody knows that President Trump is underwater in terms of his approval ratings, but also the fact that the reality is, for all this talk about foreign policy, whether it's Venezuela or Greenland, the big concern in the United States is affordability. And if you look at some of the economic data that's coming out with respect to jobs, that has started to plateau. President Trump is very aware of this, and so is his administration. And so you're already seeing things like, for example, President Trump has said, we don't know if this is actually going to happen. With respect to President Trump, it's always best to make sure until the event happens, whether he's actually going to follow through. But he's set to be going to the World Economic Forum in Davos later this month, where he will actually be headlining some of the components of the US affordability agenda. So I think President Trump, his political instincts are actually pretty good on this, which is that he recognizes that even as they're doing things in Venezuela or they're doing things in Greenland, it's very important to get back to the affordability and economic concerns of U.S. voters. And I think that's why you are seeing, him dragging in energy executives to the White House to kind of say, how does this matter for the United States? It's about energy dominance. It's not just about us going in, taking out Maduro and a bunch of military strikes. How does this actually matter economically for Americans? But I would just say it's going to be a very tough act for President Trump, because if you look at the data, even with respect to intervention in Venezuela, the majority of Americans, if you look at some of the polls, are actually opposed to U.S. intervention in Venezuela militarily, relative to those that are for it. And in Venezuela, you have concerns with respect to migration and drugs and so on and so forth. But with respect to Greenland, you don't really have those concerns. And so it's going to be more difficult if the Trump administration is wanting to take those actions to actually justify to Americans, why does this matter for us economically? Sure, this would expand the territory of the United States, and militarily there are sort of echoes of the Cold War, where Greenland actually was a major post for monitoring some of the Russian activities that happened. So there is a precedent strategically. But Americans are going to have to be convinced on the economic affordability agenda, given the fact that midterm elections are already at play. And frankly, you're already seeing a lot of candidates pivot towards the midterm elections. And so this prospect of intervention in Greenland is going to actually matter a lot with respect to the domestic landscape. So I think you're asking a very right question with respect to the domestic politics of this.
Right. Prashanth, thank you so much for being on the show today. Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran there from the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.